Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to begin looking at macroeconomics. We're going to start with the circular flow diagram and talk a little bit about gross domestic product in terms of what it is and how it's measured, as well as be able to differentiate between real and nominal GDP. And all this information is in Chapter 23 of your textbook, a chapter entitled Tracking the Macroeconomy, and it's pages 590 to 603. We're going to start by talking about the circular flow diagram first. And there are a number of ways that you could measure economic activity. And the circular flow diagram just sort of helps us see visually what kind of financial activity is going on in a very simple economy. And so in this situation, in this model, we start with a basic assumption, which is that there are two actors in the market. There are both households and there are firms. The households want to buy goods from the firms, and the firms are happy to sell them to the households, but members of the household have to be able to have money in order to buy stuff. In order to get money, they have to work. And so we see that there is a flow of money in a kind of circular pattern. We see that the people in the households want to spend at the firm, and the firm would like to send them goods and services back. In order to get the money to do that, the members of the household, who we assume own all of the factors of production, the land, labor, and capital, will provide their labor or lease out their land and capital to the firms, and the firms will pay them back in the form of wages, rents, and dividends. And so it's a sort of circular pattern where households offer labor, they receive money, the money goes back to the firms in the form of purchases of goods and services, which flow back to the households. We say that the economic activity that goes on between consumers and firms in the form of purchasing goods and services is the product market. And we say that the flow of goods and services from firms to households occurs in what's known as the factor market. So the factor market includes land, labor, and capital. And while this model does a pretty good job of explaining kind of a general idea of how the economy works and how money flows through it, it is missing something very important, and that's the role of government and foreign firms and consumers in the markets. Because right now this is a closed economy. It assumes that all of the activity occurs within the single country. But we could look at a more complex model in which there is now a government which is taking money out of the system in the form of taxes and then putting it back in the form of government purchases of services. It includes financial markets where the government may be borrowing money in order to pay for activities that it doesn't have enough taxes to cover. And it includes both imports, which is goods coming from another country into yours, and exports, which is goods from your country leaving and going to other markets in other parts of the world as well. So this is a much more complex model. We're going to leave out the rest of the world section for our class, but if you were in an AP macro class, they would include that in the last portion of open economy. When it comes to measuring the value of an economy, probably the easiest way to do it really is to just kind of add up all of the value of the spending in that circular flow to figure out how much economic activity is going on. And that number that we get is what's called the gross domestic product. But when we do that, we do need to make a distinction between something known as final goods and intermediate goods, because we want to avoid double counting economic activity. So when we talk about final goods and services, we're talking about end user products like a laptop or a TV or a car. Okay, and not intermediate goods, which are the goods that go into making the final good, because the value of the final good incorporates the value of all of the intermediate goods that went into making it. Mathematically, then, there's a formula that we use, and it's a very important formula for macroeconomics, and so it's one that you want to make sure that you memorize and take to heart for the rest of the macroeconomics course. It's pretty simple. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, meaning gross domestic product is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. So by net exports, we say we take the value of our exports, which is the value of the goods that we've made here in the country and sell somewhere else, and we subtract the imports, which is the value of the goods that we're buying from some other country. And that'll give us a sense for the economic activity within the United States. when we're talking about consumers, we're talking about durable goods like washing machines, computers, things that last a long time, as well as non-durable goods, things that don't last a very long time, like food or drinks or things that degrade quickly, paper, that kind of stuff. And we also include services, so like tax accountants and hairdressers and service technicians and things like that who come in and fix like your washing machine or your dishwasher, stuff like that. That's all consumer spending. When we're talking about investment spending, we're talking about the final purchases of machinery and other capital by businesses. That'd be like a new fax machine for your office or a new copy machine, or if you're working in a manufacturing plant, maybe it's a stamping machine that cuts out parts from metal, that kind of stuff. Also in domestic investment, we're going to count all construction, so the building of new buildings and roads and bridges, all that kind of stuff falls under investment. And the last thing we're going to look at or incorporate in domestic investment is changes in inventory. And so, with inventory, if you produce a lot of stuff and it's more than sales, so you produce 100 items and only 80 get sold, then you have 20 items in inventory. When you have items in inventory, we count them for the year they're made. And so, we don't count the sale of those items in a subsequent year when they finally do get sold. So what we're assuming is that when goods are made, even if they're not sold to the public, they are essentially sold to the company who then holds them in their inventory. When it comes to government spending, we're talking about spending by the government at all levels, so local, state, and national governments, and it's all of their purchases of labor and equipment, tanks and jet fighters and Xerox machines and check writing machines for Social Security, and anything that the government is spending money on is going to fall under G. And then finally, net exports is the value of the goods that are produced in the United States and sold elsewhere, minus the value of goods made elsewhere and sold in the United States. Because again, we're looking at the economic activity generated by the United States. And so we want to make sure that the sales in the United States that are for someone else's goods don't get counted in our GDP number. Another concept we need to keep in mind when it comes to measuring GDP is the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. With real GDP, we're looking to try and hold the price level constant so that we see whether we're actually selling more things or not, versus nominal GDP, which is expressed in today's dollars. So nominal GDP, if there's inflation and a good that cost $2 last year costs $4 now, then that gets incorporated into the nominal number, and the GDP number looks artificially large. With real GDP, we're trying to compare GDPs against each other. So we choose a base year for prices and use that base year price to compare the quantities produced in subsequent years to see whether or not there's actually more economic activity or whether the GDP number is rising simply because there are more prices or higher prices. So I'll give you an example. We take this chart where we've got corn and soybeans as the two products in the economy. If we're going to calculate nominal GDP, what I would do for 2012 is take the number of tons of corn and multiply it by the price per ton of corn and add that to the tons of soybeans times the price of soybeans. So the nominal GDP in 2012 is $14,000. If I was going to do nominal GDP for 2013, I'd take 110 tons of corn, multiply it by the $110 price of corn, and add that to the 80 tons of soybeans and $100 ton price for soybeans, and I would see that the nominal GDP rose by $20,100. So we look at that and go, oh wow, holy smokes, we increased our GDP by like 43%. This is amazing. And so, we're doing really, really well for ourselves because, look, we're making $6,100 more in GDP than we were before. The question is that really true? So let's just continue on and say, well, what's the nominal GDP for 2014? We'd say 90 tons of corn times $120 per ton and 80 tons of soybeans times $110 per ton. And we see that now in 2014 there was a drop in GDP. So we go, oh no, this isn't good. This is bad. We're losing GDP. And maybe it's true. I don't know, because we're only looking at nominal. So let's take a look at real GDP for a second. Real GDP in the base year, if we assume 2012 is the base year, real and nominal are the same. To calculate real GDP for 2013, however, what I would do is say the price of corn and the price of soybeans remains the same. So whatever the price was in 2012, we're going to use that same price for 2013 and see whether the change in GDP, nominal GDP, is driven by a change in price or if it's driven by a change in quantity. So I would do 110 tons of corn times $100 per ton, which is the base year price, and 80 tons of soybeans times $50 per ton, which is the base year price. And when I do that, I find that real GDP is actually only $15,000. So yes, our GDP increased, but not by very much. Certainly not by as much as I thought it did when I looked only at nominal. And we can see why. I mean, if you look at the numbers, you see that the number of soybeans didn't change. So we're not increasing our production of soybeans at all, and we barely increased the production of corn. So the only reason why nominal GDP rose by nearly 43% from 2012 to 2013 is because the price of corn went up a little bit and the price of soybeans went up a lot. And so the real GDP number gives us a much more accurate perspective on how the economy is doing. And if we look at 2014 and we take 90 tons of corn times the base year price of $100 and 80 tons of soybeans times the base year price of $50, we see that, in fact, the loss in real GDP is worse than we thought it was when we were looking at nominal. Because nominal, we lost $500, and that's bad, but now when we look at real GDP, we've actually lost $2,000. The loss is even more than we thought. And that's why we focus on real GDP and not on nominal. A couple of final thoughts on real GDP for right now, and that is, first off, when we're comparing real GDP for the United States from year to year, that's a reasonable comparison. But if we're going to try and compare real GDP for the U.S. to real GDP for Canada, say, it's not a particularly fair comparison, in large part because the U.S. is so much larger than Canada. We have so many more people. And so one of the measures that people use is GDP per capita, or GDP per person. So what you would do to calculate per capita GDP is take the total GDP and divide it by the population. And that would tell you essentially how much of the economy is represented by each individual. And that gives you a much more accurate comparison between countries. There are some other drawbacks, I suppose, to GDP that you have to keep in mind when evaluating economic activity in the United States. And that is, some good activities actually hurt GDP. So, for example, volunteerism and taking time off, they don't add to GDP. They take away, well, they don't necessarily take away from GDP, but they certainly don't add. If you're working for free, you're doing economic activity. You're helping out the economy, I suppose, by helping people in need, but it doesn't get added to GDP. And when you're not working, meaning you're not adding production, but no one's going to argue that leisure is a bad thing. Even when you're just working around your house, instead of hiring somebody, when you do a DIY job, you're not helping GDP other than just the parts you're buying. But you could be adding to GDP by hiring a contractor and adding to consumption, but you're not when you're doing it on your own. But no one would argue that working around your house is actually a bad thing. And large GDP doesn't always mean that you're going to be happy. For example, you can increase GDP by putting steel bars on your doors and windows because you feel unsafe, and so GDP goes up. But is that really a good thing? Probably not. Or cleaning up after a hurricane or a storm or riots, while you might initially think that helps GDP, it's not really good, and it's certainly not actually helping GDP, because all that does when something breaks and has to get repaired is it diverts productive money into unproductive uses by replacing stuff you already had. So you're not really creating new, you're just fixing old. And so that's not actually a positive for net GDP. That's enough for today. We're going to do some practice in class, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye.